Thank you so much, Zach. It's great to be back. We had the pleasure, as Zach said, to attend our first CultureCon in August and really loved it. And excited to be back, albeit in a virtual environment, to share similar content, but a little bit different as well. So I trust I can share now. Oh no, I can't share. So maybe you can enable me, Zach. What I want to do is I want to start off with a little bit of self reflection before I dive into my presentation. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so I'm gonna put a link in the chat, and when you click on this link, you should be presented with this chart, this four quadrant chart, and there's three dots at the top. One's labeled self-employed, corporate job, other, and I just want to get a quick feel for each of you. And if you're in a corporate job or have had a corporate job or many corporate jobs over your career, I'd like you to, like, what you do is you click on one of these dots or all of them if they pertain to you, and it'll drop the dot on a random location on the chart, and then I want you to move it to the place that best describes your experience of that. So if you have been in a corporate job, have you loved it? Have you had a long tenure, a short-lived tenure? And or maybe you haven't loved it so much. Like, where would you put your corporate arc experience on this chart? And maybe you've been self-employed. So if you have, you can click that dot and move it to where you um, what best describes your experience of being self-employed. And maybe you've done something other than being self-employed or being in a corporate job. Maybe it's academics, maybe it's nonprofit somewhere else. You can click the other dot. So click whichever ones pertain to you, and then you'll hit this little submit button once you've situated those dots on the chart. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. If you have any technical issues, just send me a note in the chat, and I'm going to plop this link in the chat. Here we go. All right, there it is. And I'm going to keep an eye on how it's coming along. Maybe we could have some Jeopardy music in here. I don't know. Maybe not. Okay, I see people are in, which is good. Any issues? Let me see. Are there any technical issues? No? We're good? Okay, I see folks are in here. We've got some submissions coming in, which is good. Give another 5-10 seconds for people to do this. Nice to see we have a good turnout today. All right, how are we doing here? Okay, looks like most people have submitted. So let's take a look at this really quick. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so we can take a look at what has our experience been in the working world. So I trust everyone can see my screen. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here. Okay, so corporate job. So a lot of us have had corporate jobs. Some of us not so much. Short-lived experience, probably for good reason. A lot of us though have loved it, which is a great to see. Some of us have had a short-lived experience that was good. Others have been in it for a while. That makes a lot of sense. What about self-employed? Are there any self-employed people? Yeah. Okay, some self-employed experiences, loved it. Some short tenure, long tenure. And then are there folks in the other category? Yeah, but interestingly, most of us here in this room have had a good work experience, which is really great to see. If we look at the averages of all of these, it's interesting to see that self-employed it comes out a little bit on top, but in general, most of us have had a good experience. Okay, good. That's good to see. I'm going to jump into my presentation. Part of why I wanted to do the self-reflection exercise is I wanted to see how people stood relative to my own experience. My career, my background's in tech, and I worked for a couple of medical software startups for the first 15 years of my career. And I did not love it. It was not a super fun experience. These companies were very successful. They went public, made lots of money, but there were times where it felt like I was living in a sitcom that was not very funny, and didn't really understand why at the time things felt so dysfunctional. A point came in my career where I got promoted to management, and I was like, I better like learn how to become a manager. So I decided to go back to business school back in '06, '07. And in one of my first management classes, I learned about the concept of informal networks, that even though we work in hierarchical structures, a lot of work happens through informal channels, through informal relationships, like who people trust, and that may be very independent of the formal hierarchical structure. And so for me, this was like an aha cloud parting moment. I felt like this was a powerful way to overcome a lot of the dysfunction that I had been experiencing in my corporate experience. And so I looked for some tools that would allow me to do this mapping quickly and easily. And when I didn't find what I was looking for, I thought maybe I should build my own. And so I teamed up with a classmate of mine, my wife as well, and we started Key Hubs back in 2008. And over the last 14 years, we've worked with a lot of well-known brands here in the Twin Cities, which is where we're based, and elsewhere, and we've had some great press. I did a TEDx talk a while ago. And basically, the premise of our business from the beginning has been this idea of making the invisible visible, right? The org chart is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's how leaders like to think work gets done, through the chain of command. But if you ask people in an organization things like, who do you trust, who do you socialize with, when you're in a crunch, who do you go to help you get your job done? If you take those answers and you map them out, you end up with an informal network that looks very different from the formal hierarchy. And what you find is that oftentimes people like buried in the hierarchy actually have a tremendous amount of influence and impact on the business that is oftentimes not visible to the higher ups. And this is particularly true in the larger your organization. When you get into 50, 100 plus employees, this dynamic comes into play. And so here's an example of an informal network that we mapped in a division of a large company that was undergoing a lot of change, and they wanted to understand who the change agents were. And so we asked this question, like, when our organization is going through a lot of change, who do you go to help navigate that change? And when we dive, and so you have certain individuals that are identified more than others, so their influence, their circle of influence is larger. They're a larger circle in this network. And so we can identify three key influential change agents in this network that are not necessarily connected to one another. And if we look at how we influence one another, there's a lot of research that shows that things like ideas, behaviors, emotions can spread through social networks in contagious fashion, up to 3 degrees of separation, meaning we don't just influence our immediate friends, we have the ability to influence others through our friends, friends, friends. Okay, so if we look at this network and we identify three key influencers in disparate parts of the informal network in an organization, and we go 2 degrees out, 3 degrees out, they touch almost everyone in that organization, with the exception of a few individuals on the periphery of the network. But when we take this network and we overlay it on the formal hierarchical structure, we often see that these key influencers they exist at all levels of the hierarchy. It's independent of the hierarchy. And so a lot of decision making in businesses is done by looking at the formal org chart, and there's not this understanding of, well, who has influence, who's impacting people in the ways that we can't visualize on the formal org chart. And that's where we come in to take the guesswork out of this process. Now, there's this legendary book called Good to Great, where they talk about how average companies evolve into exceptional companies. And what they found is that the essential ingredient of what makes good companies great is the simple idea of getting the right people on the bus in the right seats. That you can have all the plans you want and strategies you want to create, but if you don't have the right people on the bus sitting in the right seats, you're likely going to be average, or you're going to be below average. And when we look at how good leaders are at identifying who these key people are that need to be on the bus in the right seats, some of the business research suggests that leaders are only about 30 to 40% accurate at identifying these key influential connectors inside organizations. Now, that's good if you're playing baseball. That's a pretty good batting average. But if you're trying to go from good to great, you really need to have a much higher level of accuracy in identifying who these key influencers are. And so that's where we come in, is we can do this using data-driven insights and methodologies. And one of the things that we're also finding in our work is that when we sit down with leaders and ask them their perceived influence. So before we show any of the results, we'll often sit down with senior executives and say, what do you think your influence is along these different dimensions that we measured? Oftentimes leaders' self-perception is, I have a lot of influence because everyone smiles when I walk in the room and they nod their head. Well, of course they do, because it's in their best interest to manage up. Their livelihood hinges on that. When we look at the actual Key Hubs data, we often see this huge disparity between self-perception and others' experience of leaders around these dimensions of influence, things like, trust and integrity and inspiration and so forth. And there's often this other group of individual contributors or mid-level managers that garner, in many cases, more influence than the senior executives. And so it's super important for leaders and organizations to understand this dynamic, to be clear around this dynamic so that you can get the right people on the bus in the right seat. So every organization has a leadership team, the formal hierarchy, the titles, the status, but that doesn't necessarily equate to real influence. Those two can be independent. There's oftentimes overlap, but not always. And so if you don't know who the influencers are or what your own influence is as a leader, it's really hard to get organizational alignment. So the way we look at our work is we go in and we find these key, connected, highly influential people that exist at all levels of the hierarchical structure. We bring them into line of sight with each other and leaders, and it's from this place that you can get these influential people aligned, rowing in the same direction as the vision and mission of the organization and leadership. Now, one of the questions that we often get is, well, what constitutes an influencer? Like, in all the work that we've done in all these different organizations, has there been a thread or certain attributes that tend to show up in these highly connected collaborative folks inside organizations? And we have found some common threads. One of the things that we find in these highly influential people is that they tend to be genuinely curious about other people. They're interested in people in a genuine way. And they're not just curious, but they're also helpful. They find problems and they seek to solve them. And when people come to them for advice or help, they tend to, go the extra distance in being helpful, and they do it with a smile. So they're not doing it in a resentful way. And so these are some of the common threads that we see showing up in these key hubs in organizations that we've mapped over, many years in many different organizations and sectors. So I just want you to keep that in mind for a moment. Now, some business leaders will look at this and say, well, that's good touchy-feely stuff, but how does it really impact the bottom line or the top line for that matter? Well, we've used this type of insight, this network data, to literally drive top-line revenue results. So we've worked with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, financial services companies, and after doing a lot of these evaluations inside a corporate office of a large organization, the salespeople got wind of the work that we were doing, and they said, maybe there's a relationship between the informal networks in our sales divisions and the actual outcomes or sales performance of those divisions. And so we did a comprehensive mapping assessment across 25 different sales divisions in a national sales organization, and we found some very interesting patterns related to the informal networks and the performance of those sales divisions. So on the left-hand side, I have a high-performing sales division. We ask the question, who's a role model when it comes to sales, and who inspires you to be the same, to be a role model? And so in this top-performing division, you can see there's some key influential role models, and this is a low-performing division on the right-hand side. Now, we look at those networks from this angle, and we can say, okay, there's key hubs in both of these networks. I've highlighted 2 key hubs in each of these sales divisions, one on the left, one on the right, in this orange and purple color. So at this level, we don't really see, the network's not really telling us much about what might be causing high performance in the left-hand division and what's might be contributing to low performance in the right-hand division. And so what we can do is look at these divisions through another network lens. So we also ask the question around help. So if you need help when it comes to a sales issue or sales or business development question, who do you go to for support? And so what we've done is we've highlighted the key role models in each of these divisions. And what we see is that the role model in the high performing division has a lot more influence, or has been selected many more times in the helpers network, whereas the role model in the low performing division, for whatever reason, is not really perceived as a helper. And so what we saw is this pattern playing out over and over again in high and low performing divisions. And this was reinforced when we looked at the question around collaborative selling. So collaboration is an important part of our selling strategy. Who do you frequently collaborate with? Again, in the high performing division, the role model, the one that everyone looks to as an example of exceptional selling, is also collaborating with others in division around selling, whereas in the low performing division, for whatever reason, proximity, role, personality, there are a lot of factors in each of these divisions, the role model is really nowhere to be found. They're not collaborating with the other salespeople that probably need this role model's help. So if we look at the first degree network around these two influencers and we go 2 degrees out, 3 degrees out, it starts to become clear why the high performing division is doing so well. They have access, they can approach and work with the role model, whereas in the low performing division, not so much. And this was a pattern that we saw playing out. We were able to help this large company leverage this data to shift their formal and informal structures just a little bit, so that in each division, the role model was incentivized to be helpful and to be collaborative. And within 12 months, they significantly increased their top line revenue as a result of these changes to their informal and formal structures. So being helpful, being positive, being curious, these are values and capabilities, soft skills that have direct and immediate impact on a revenue generation and top line growth of a business. Okay, so with that, what I'm going to do is we're going to do another self-reflection exercise. And I'm going to put a link in the chat. And when you click on that link, you're going to be presented with this. And I want you to think about whether or not you've known a key hub that you've worked with or seen in action over the arc of your career. And I just want you to think of the most impactful key hub you've ever worked with. And I want you to drop this dot on the chart and indicate, when you think about that key hub, were they appreciated and valued at the company you were at? Were they visible to leadership, or were they hidden? Or were they underappreciated and undervalued? So where was that key hub, in your perception, viewed inside your organization? So with that, I'm going to drop this link in the chat here. Give me one moment. Okay, here it comes. There it is. All right. Let me know if you have any technical issues. I'm going to take a look and see that. I see the responses are coming in. Good. Very good. I see responses coming in. Take another 5-10 seconds. Be sure to hit that submit button in the lower right. Have you worked with a key hub, and how are they perceived inside your organization? Okay, let's take a look here. I'm going to share my screen again. And so how do the key hubs do the ones that you're aware of? And so this is what we got. So it looks like many of you worked with a key hub. Maybe you were the key hub. And there's kind of most of them were somewhat visible or quite visible to leadership, which is good, but not all of them were, appreciated and valued. And so it's just kind of interesting to see what your own personal experience is when we look at the average. Yeah, I mean, we're right there. Well, a good thing is there's visibility to leadership, but it doesn't look like these hubs were fully valued or appreciated or leveraged in a manner that could benefit the business. And so, like I said, our own experience in doing this work is maybe, there might be an overlap of about 30 to 40% of leaderships perceiving the right people. And then whether they're actually leveraging them in the right way is a whole other thing. And we're seeing something similar here as well. Okay, good. So I'm going to go back to my presentation. Oh, actually, before I go back to my presentation, I'm gonna drop another link in the chat. We'll do one more self-reflection, and we're gonna transition to looking at networks through a slightly different lens. So the next link that I put in the chat, you're gonna be presented with this matrix, and basically what I want you to do is think about the organization you work in right now, or the most recent organization you've worked in. And I want you to rate your organization in terms of how collaborative it is, how connected it is. Do you feel like it's siloed versus connected? Do you feel it's collaborative versus territorial? So I'd like you to rate your organization. And then I'd like you to rate what your perception is of most organizations out there relative to the one that you work in, just based on, your conversations you've had with peers, things you've read, so forth. It's purely your perception. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to put this link in the chat. Here it comes. Okay, there it is. I'm going to see how we're doing here. Okay, I see most of you guys are in here. Very good. Let me know if you're having any technical issues. Looks like we're good on that front. Take another 10 seconds or so. Okay, so most of you have submitted. Let's take a look at these results. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Let's see how do organizations stand? The one you work in, ones you've heard about. So when we look at my organization, some of you live in highly connected collaborative organizations or work in connected collaborative organizations, which is good, but that's not necessarily a universal experience. We have some folks where it could be more connected, could be more collaborative. When we look at the average, still doing pretty good in this upper right quadrant. When we look at perceptions of other organizations, quite a bit different, right? How do we know your organization isn't one of these organizations, right? Your perception might be very different than others. But yeah, there's this general feel that organization, that's why CultureCon exists and why there's so much work out there to be done with and on organizations, because we know that it's easy for organizations to get siloed and territorial, less connected, and so forth. So when we compare the averages between your organization and the others out there, there's definitely a gap. And the whole idea is to move this needle, this dial, towards a more collaborative, connected workplace, community, economy, and so forth. Okay, so good. I wanted to get a little take on this because when we look at, one second, I'll get rid of my chat. In doing this work over the last 10 plus years of mapping networks, one of the things that we see playing out quite a bit in organizations is this siloed effect that, yeah, people are connected on some level, but when we overlay things like team or geographies, the silos begin to pop out. There's oftentimes this birds of a feather flock together phenomenon. And even in certain teams, we see that there are silos, certain groups not connected to certain groups. And this impacts the way teams work together and ultimately impacts the performance of the organization because there's a lack of collaboration, a lack of knowledge share. One of the things that we often see when we dive deeper into these silos is that a lot of times the silo effect is due to things like culture and language. Like in this case, we're looking at this organization from a team level, and we saw this green team was siloed. When we look at it from a regional perspective, we see that these silos in the green team were largely due to things like culture and language. Like Japan's off on their own, North America and UK are connected to one another, but they're not really connected to Pacific Rim. And so this is a phenomenon we see pretty much everywhere we go, that birds of a feather flock together. And if you look at the social science research on how networks tend to form, if you put a bunch of strangers in a room, what will naturally happen over time is people will gravitate towards those that kind of look like them or do similar kind of work, and they'll say, hey, I'm going to connect you to other people that look like us or do similar kind of work, and you end up getting these polarized cultures. It's sort of our natural tendency to stick to our knitting and go towards what's comfortable. But when we look at the research, the volumes of research around the impact of diversity on business, we know that diversity is good for business. Public companies with greater diversity in management are more likely to have better financial returns. CEOs with more diverse social networks see more success to the tune of 30 million in market capitalization. Just a CEO having a more diverse social network, and there's more recent studies that indicate that there might be a relationship between our social networks and our neural networks or our brain functioning, that when we have more diverse social friend circle, it tends to contribute to more dynamic brain activity because we're having to harmonize differing points of view, and we're having to serve as a translator of different ideas, and that becomes the basis for innovative thinking and the creative combination of different ideas. And so even though it is easy and comfortable for us to stick to what we know and what is familiar, what the literature is suggesting is that we become more innovative, more effective, more successful when we're stepping out of our comfort zone and connecting with difference. So when we look at this network that we mapped, there's an individual here in this network that's highly influential, but most of their immediate connections are in their same region. So they're only going to have access to a certain perspective and a certain kind of information. Whereas this key hub in this network is also highly connected, but connected to people from all different parts of the organization, all different geographical locations. So they're going to be in a unique, and I would say competitive advantage, because they're going to have points of view and perspectives that this other key hub doesn't have. And so what we've done in doing this mapping, we often go into organizations and in year one see a lot of silos, a lot of disconnects, people on the same team or same division very well connected, but not a lot of cross-pollination happening. But we can leverage these influencers and bridgers and create certain strategies, changes to the formal and informal structure that can create a more effective cross-pollinating culture. And we've seen that happen 6 months later, 12 months later, and see where is the cross-pollination happening, which is going to lead to more ideas, different ideas, more collaboration. And we can also see where there are still area for improvement. As you can see, like the green team, the green division here is still fairly homogenous and not connected to the rest of these other two divisions. So it's interesting that when we look at our cities, for example, by ethnicity, we aren't just seeing this silo effect play out in our social networks or our inside organizations, but this pattern is playing out at a societal level. I mean, we see this in our own cities. Birds of a feather flock together. When we look at New York City by ethnicity, birds of a feather are largely flocking together. Chicago, Los Angeles, Minneapolis is no different. And so I think, we're confronted with a challenge, but I think we also have in front of us, a huge opportunity. America is already a very innovative, entrepreneurial beacon in the world. And yet we still find ourselves in this situation, I feel, still sitting on a gold mine of opportunity and innovation. And I think it's just a matter of taking these essential traits that we find showing up in key influencers inside organizations, right? Being genuinely curious, being helpful, being positive, and extending that beyond our immediate circle of friends and bringing those traits of influence outside our comfort zone. So I want to do one more self-reflection exercise, and in this one's going to be a little bit different. Um, it's going to be like a two-step process. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat. It's going to ask you for your name. So put in your first and last name. And you're going to be presented with this four-quadrant chart. And there's going to be two dots on the chart, a yellow one and a green dot. And the yellow one is where you think you are along these polarities. Like, do you feel like your networks are diverse, like your social and professional networks, or do you feel your networks are fairly homogenous? I mean, think about like the ethnicities, the religion, the political disposition, professional sectors that you're associating with. How diverse do you feel your network is? And do you feel like you're connected to a lot of different people, or do you feel your network is smaller and you're maybe more closely connected to a few? So place this yellow dot on the location that you see yourself, and then the green dot is more aspirational. So like over the next 6 months, where would you like to move the dial, if at all? And then hit the next button and leave that window open. It'll say, please wait while everyone puts in their submissions. We're going to come back to that in just a second. So I'm going to post the link in the chat. Again, you're going to enter your name, you're going to hit the next button, then you're going to leave that window open. Okay, here it is. I'm also going to participate in this exercise. See how we're doing here. Okay, I see that most of us are in. Some of us have done our self-rating. Very good. Waiting for a couple of more here. Most everyone has submitted. Okay, great. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit a button on my end, and what that'll do is it will refresh your screen. You should see the chart again where you put your yellow and green dot. And then there's going to be a drop-down menu at the top that lists everyone who's present here. And I want you to look at the list and see, do you know anyone here on this call? Do you have an impression about them? What I'd like you to do is provide a rating of people you know on this call. So when you pick that person's name, it'll drop a blue dot with their name on it at a random location on the chart, and then you can move that blue dot around. And I want you to move the blue dot of the person you've selected to the place on the chart that represents how your perception of their networks and how big their networks are and how diverse they are. So this is going to give us an opportunity to see, is our perception of ourselves similar to how others perceive us. Okay, and then we'll explain why we're going through this process here, and I'm also going to do this as well. So okay, I see some people are starting to put in their rating. That's good. All right, I see people are in here doing their thing, really good. And then when you submit, go ahead and leave that window open. It'll say, please wait while we compile the results. Leave that window open because we're going to come back to it. I'm just going to check and see how we're doing here. Okay, good. Looks like most of us have submitted. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen and we're just going to take a look at this really quick. Where is my Zoom window? Oh, there it is. Okay. All right, I'm going to share. Someone said something in the chat. Okay, someone said I accidentally selected someone. I don't know how. I think if you double click on the button, it should allow you to remove it, or if you hold it down, perhaps. If not, don't worry about it. You can just, put that person right in the middle, maybe. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, so how did we do? If we look at our self ratings here, so some of us feel like our networks are diverse, but we're connected to a few. Most of us see ourselves as having a large network. Most of us feeling like our networks are fairly diverse, although some of us feel networks are kind of homogenous. I would imagine after hearing this talk, you're like, yeah, I better diversify my networks. It's good for my brain. It's good for it's good for the world. Okay, so this is good. If we look at the averages here between how we see ourselves and where we want to go, this is sort of the gap. And then we rated one another. And so these blue dots represent an aggregate of everybody's rating. And so the perception here of the people is that people here have a broad network and they're fairly diverse. So what this says is we're a little humble about ourselves, that the perceptions of our own networks are, one could argue, better than how we see it. So that's good. And then, the nice thing here is, everyone has their own individual profile of how they see themselves and how they're perceived. And I can push that to all of you so you can see that. But this process, this quick, agile 360 feedback process also reveals, in a sense, how we're connected to one another, because we rated people we knew and we can quickly see, like, in this group, how are we connected, who has influence, who might be new to this group and on the periphery of the network. And so this just gives you a taste of how quick and easy it can be to uncover the formal structure or the hidden dynamic that exists in a group, even if we're a bunch of strangers coming together, and getting a sense for, okay, what is the informal dynamic in this system. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a taste of how these tools can be used to uncover some of the things we've talked about. And I'm just going to hit this approve button and I'm going to reveal the network. So if you want to see where you are in this network, there'll be a link at the top of your screen. And so with that, what I'll do is I'll pause. We've done a lot of self-reflection and I've thrown a lot of slides at you, and what I'd like to do is maybe pause and just get some of your reactions, maybe to your own data and the data that we've shared, and any of the content in the presentation. So I'll open it up now for any questions.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. I have to admit, I did that survey piece with everyone and I rated everyone. So that was like incomplete results, just FYI.
No problem.
I didn't realize what I was doing there for a second. But I do have a question, and I don't know if this is how to ask it, but I have a social network, right? And when I think about my social capital, it's very it's my own, and so I'm at a point now where I'm curious to know what steps should I be taking, or if it's reasonable to capitalize off my social network. Like, what does that look like in terms of capital? Like, I would love to make money off of this. Like, obviously I can be a consultant, but I'm curious to know, like, what's your point of view on that?
Well, in my point of view is that connections and networks are everything. Whatever objective you're looking to achieve, to me, in my own experience, and if you look at the literature and the way networks work, all good things come through connection. And it may not be your immediate connections, but that's the starting place, because the only way to effectively and efficiently and more seamlessly get to like second and third degree connections is through your immediate network and asking for warm introductions. So what I my first question to you would be is, what is your objective? Are you trying to grow business? Are you trying to get another job? Are you just trying to expand your horizons? Are you trying to diversify your perspective? Depending on what you're, it doesn't have to be, um, your journey through networks doesn't have to be one with a specific financial outcome. Oftentimes it is. But whatever the objective is, it's sort of like, okay, who in my network do I know that I can connect to around this? And then who might they know that can connect me to my aspiration or my objective? And when you follow that connection trail, your network grows, you get introduced to new people, and oftentimes you're going to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. What's your reaction to that, or any other question around that?
Well, that's helpful. I like that point of view, just in terms of like not making it about the dollar amount, but more so about the quality of relationships will ultimately lead to a dollar amount. So yeah, I like that one. Thank
Cool.
you for sharing
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you for this presentation as well.
Thank you. Other questions, reflections, comments, ahas? I see some familiar faces from CultureCon on here. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. I was going to say, every time I'm always like, whew, there's a lot to learn from here, or my mind's always just blown. One thing is I just think of me realizing more and more that I was a key influencer, even in my past organization. And I just think, that's not something you just put on your resume, you know, or, it's how do you show that value when you're going somewhere new? And that's where I feel like, um, I don't know, maybe you have thoughts or suggestions on that for some of us that are those key influencer people, and how to keep helping the organization and being curious, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, well, yeah, that's a tough thing. It'd be really cool if you could take proof of it, right, or something like, look, this is me on this map. But that's not always realistic, or even effective per se. I think if you're a key hub in an organization, you're looking to go to other places and have a testimony around that. I think probably the best thing would be is to talk to the people who were impacted by your key hubness in where you were working, and say, look, would you be willing to speak to this, be a referral for me? First, make sure if they see eye to eye with you, right? Like, you could go to them and say, look, I think I was a key hub. Didn't you think I was a key hub too? And what were the things that made me one? Would you be willing to speak to that in a future uh, job exploration or business opportunity? Then you have someone else speaking for you, someone else shining a light on your abilities, and I think that oftentimes carries way more weight than you beating your own, tooting your own horn. Other questions? Good question. Okay, so someone put something in the chat here. Crystal shared, regarding siloed work, what advice do you have on how to best leverage bridgers or create more cross team collaboration? Well, yeah, so I think that's great. First is to identify, right, who these people are. You could do it, by talking to people or going through a more formal study like the kinds we do. And then once you know who these hubs and bridges are, I think it's figuring out. Yeah, I think one of the most effective ways to create, there's several things I can think about, strategies to create this bridging experience. One is, identifying, who are the highly influential people, connected people in an organization, and determining, are they connected with another? Because one of the things we often see, and especially in large organizations, is you have these really curious, helpful, positive people, but they're all like in different parts of the network. What would happen if you got those individuals, and that's usually just 5 to 10, getting together you know, um, doing brain mind melds and empowering them to solve some of a company's most difficult problems. They're the ones who are most connected to everyone in the organization, probably have the greatest understanding of what's going well and what's not. You get those people in a room together, and you're going to unleash some serious potential. So that's one approach. The other thing that I think is greatly and sorely missing in organizations, ones that are really entrenched in hierarchical structure, is there's oftentimes in organizations there's a lot of cross-functional collaboration happening, or cross-functional teams at the senior level, the director level, the managerial level. But I don't see, and I haven't seen enough cross hierarchical teams where you bring together the highly influential people that exist at all levels of the hierarchy. And that's just not happening enough. And I think those two things, like understanding who your bridges and influencers are and getting them in the same room, and then doing that regardless of their title and status. So you could have the CEO sitting together with an entry level admin, but is highly connected. I mean, there's cross pollination there that I think is sorely missing in most organizations. So I think those are probably the two things that I would suggest looking at or doing more of. Great question, Crystal. Other questions?
Because I like you mentioning the cross hierarchical. I think some of the challenges with that could be people's comfort level with speaking up, because it may be easy to influence, somebody in the same, area or level, right? So perceived power dynamic. Is there any suggestion that you have, if you suggest doing those cross hierarchical aspects to help set the stage for more open dialogue?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, it would probably take some legwork and some repeated meetings and sort of de-emphasizing title and status in that container. Say, look, we're here. We're going to leave our titles at the door. We're just human beings here. I want you to forget our role and focus maybe at the problem at hand. And maybe in the beginning for the higher title or higher rank individuals to play more of a listening role than a speaking role. Because if they start speaking, everyone's going to be quiet. But if they defer and say, look, we're here to listen. And, again, this would require forethought, planning, and strategizing to create the kinds of conditions that would evoke collaborative sharing and collaborative working with people that don't share that same high rank. So yeah, that's the challenge, and that's why I think it's probably not done very much, because like, why would we do this? It's too painful, it's too difficult. But again, it's doing the uncomfortable thing, the unconventional thing, that's going to yield I think unconventional and extraordinary results.
Yeah, great. I like that idea of making sure that they have awareness and not speak up first, let other people speak up, or maybe for the first couple of meetings say you're only allowed to ask questions.
Yes, exactly.
To understand, eventually maybe you can chime in, but let's set the stage. And if all you're doing is showing your curiosity to learn more from what other people are saying, that may be good.
Yeah, and I also
thanks for that.
yeah, and one other point along those lines is, if you do this type of analysis and you have the visuals, and the CEO or that leadership team sees that Mary is this highly influential person, before they just saw her through the lens of her title and her salary, but now they're seeing her through the lens of her influence, they're going to show up differently with Mary. And if Mary knows her influence now, and that in some instances, in some dimensions, she has more influence than the CEO, she's going to show up differently in that container as well, in that that small meeting group. So a lot of the setting the stage is helping all of the players understand their unique role independent of hierarchical structure. And that in and of itself can change the dynamic, that cross hierarchical dynamic significantly. So yeah, that's all good. All these things are needed. Thank you. Other questions? This is really great. Appreciate it.
Do you feel that your program is best for certain sizes of companies?
Well, like some of the tools we've used just now that you saw on the call can be used with groups as small as 5. And some of the more sophisticated mapping and uncovering of hidden influencers tends to work best when we're looking at teams and organizations of more than 20.
Okay.
A lot of our work has been done on teams between 20 and 200, like a divisional size, although we have done mappings in the thousands. So it depends on the problem that is attempting to be solved or addressed and how wide of a net the organization wants to cast. But those are things that we help in our discovery process. Is how broad do we want to go? What do we want the scope to be given the challenge at hand? Those are some of the typical numbers we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Any other questions? I'd invite, I'm going to just share my information here so you have that. This is my contact information. You can also find me on LinkedIn, but I'd invite you to check out our website if you want to connect and explore some of these ideas more. This is my email. Again, I can be found on LinkedIn as well. My wife and partner is also here, Priya. Some of you might be connected with her. We'd invite you to reach out to both of us and stay connected. We've been doing this for 10 plus years and don't have any desire to slow down or stop doing this work. We see the impact and the aha that it provides to the companies and organizations we engage with. And this tool that you experienced today is a relatively new tool that we've rolled out that can enable others to start doing the work that we're doing. So we have a growing community of partners and practitioners that have become licensed in key hubs and are doing these kinds of polling and network mapping with audiences and teams virtually and in person. So we're excited about growing our community and connecting with other like-minded people, professionals, and we're grateful to Nick and Zach for inviting us to CultureCon and inviting us into this community and today on this webinar. Really grateful for all of you for taking the time and look forward to staying connected.
Hey, Vikas, can I ask one final question? Sorry, I know you just did your wrap up.
Oh, no, that's okay. Please.
Just curious to know if you've ever given advice to someone who maybe has made connections with what I've perceived as someone who are those influencers, but a lot of times they aren't the C-suite or leadership status always, maybe one or two, but how do you get someone to maybe tap into the connections? Because as you say, the decisions come from that C-suite, the leadership. So how do you bridge that gap of you've made such a connection across the company that you yourself are an influencer, but maybe not being seen, as we saw on like one of the grids you had us do, maybe doesn't have that buy-in with leadership that ends up making the decision. So how do you kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a really good point. If I understand your question correctly, one of the things we've seen in our work is, the top-down perceptions are oftentimes very different than the bottom-up perceptions. So you may have a leader, might not be at the top, but might be number 2, number 3. They're super good at managing down and sideways. They're less concerned about like kissing up, for example. And so everyone loves them, and they're highly influential. But they're kind of a problem with the senior leadership team because they're not kissing up. They're not ones. They're kind of the union leader. There's this sort of union leader archetype where They're very influential among the masses, but not necessarily in favor with the senior leaders. And this can cause problems. Uh, you know, it creates kind of a dichotomy in the organization. And so I think it's really a lot of times senior leaders don't know how much influence a certain person has. And so they might write someone off because they're not towing the line. But when they leave, it destroys morale in the organization because they had no idea how much this person was actually loved. The hierarchy sort of hid that from view. So I think it's super important for for leaders to do this so they know, like, do I really know who has followership? There's a really big difference between title status and actual followership. And so, yeah, we have worked with organizations where there was this tension between like the CEO and the second in command, and a difference of opinion between the CEO and the second in command, but also the CEO didn't have the same kind of influence that the second in command had. And so, yeah, that's something that once we understand that dynamic, then we can begin helping both of those leaders or several of those leaders begin working through the challenges and the dichotomy that brings, coaching, team building, helping to facilitate different points of view so that a situation like that doesn't implode and create something very costly for the organization. Does that address sort of what you're bringing up?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.